Hey everybody, we're back again, and now we're going to talk about plant sex. Yay! On a day when I can't even believe this is happening outside. Crazy snow. Doesn't matter. Salamanders are moving anyway, so there. Okay, so let's talk about plant sex. Plant reproduction, more specifically. So this first learning objective wants you to explain the mechanisms of asexual reproduction in plants. So we're going to start there before we go to sexual forms. And what you'll of course see is that there's many similarities to asexual reproduction in plants as to animals, but there are some decided differences as well. So most plants can reproduce asexually and can make clones. And I wish we had time to go into all the different kinds of things plants can do that animals can't, because they are crazy, crazy weird. But in terms of reproduction, so they can reproduce asexually. Most plants actually produce sexually, but let's talk about those different forms of asexual reproduction in plants, some of which we've actually already covered this semester. So we talked about what rhizomes are, right? So these are modified stems that are growing underground. And with rhizomes, you can have these independent individuals that grow up along the continuously growing rhizome. Now, if any of these individuals was to be separated from the rest of the rhizome, then that would result in an independent individual growing, and so that would represent asexual reproduction. So you can think of this as being almost identical to fission. In fact, it is identical to fission in animals. They also can reproduce asexually via corms. So corms are basically underground bulbs. So they're modified underground stems, but they're basically bulbs, and so they would be used for storage of materials, of nutrient materials over the winter. But what you have here is a parent corm, and you can see all these little individual new corms that are developing, and these will ultimately develop into full individuals, just like you have here on top. So you can think of this as being virtually identical to budding in animals, where here you have a plant and you have a little bitty, mini me that's developing and will eventually like pop off and become its own separate individual. So second form of asexual reproduction in plants. This is a really cute and fun one. So these are plantlets. So along the margins of leaves of some plants that can do this, you'll have these little individuals that will develop and grow. These will actually fall off the plant, fall to the ground, and will continue development and will form a fully mature additional new plant. So that's a third form of asexual reproduction in plants. And lastly is apomixis. So what happens in some plants is you can have seeds. This is a very familiar dandelion that I'm sure you're all very familiar with. So these seeds can actually be produced via mitosis, and they can then go off in the wind, as you see that happens in the spring. So when seeds develop without the incorporation of male sperm, or with pollen grains, then this is called apomixis. So you have 4 different kinds of sexual reproduction in plant, right? So you have apomixis, you have plantlets, you have corms, and you have rhizomes. Okay, so now let's go on to the alternation of generations. So this is a hallmark feature of many plants. Excuse me. And it's called this because not only is there a sequence of going from one generation to the next, which of course we do in animals, but in this case, each generation is alternating between haploid and diploid. And I think it's important to note that while of course animals produce haploid gametes that then fuse into diploid organisms most of the time, diploid zygotes, that's not what we're talking about in plants. In this case, not only is it an alternation of generations of haploid and diploid, but the haploid isn't just gametes. These are multicellular individuals where all of the cells are haploid. So let me show you. So most plants reproduce sexually, producing offspring that are genetically different from one another and from their parents. So just like in animals. Okay, the generations are referred to as the sporophyte generation and the gametophyte generation. Both are multicellular, so we're not talking about single cells here, although there is a portion where a single cell is involved. But both are multicellular. The sporophyte is the diploid stage. The gametophyte is the haploid stage. And you can think of it as the here, let's go through the pieces together. Okay, so this slide lays out all 5 steps. Let me just talk you through them, and then I'll show them to you on the next slide on the figure, okay? So you have sporangia, which are cells, within the sporophyte. Remember, the sporophyte is that diploid multicellular stage. But that stage is going to produce haploid spores, and it's going to do it by meiosis. Okay? The spores, again, haploid, are then going to undergo mitosis and develop into a multicellular haploid gametophyte. And I know it's like a total mind blow at this point if you're not already familiar with how this works. So I find I have to go over this several times and look at the figures to really get it straight in my head. And it's really helpful if you can look at all kinds of different plants to see how they do it. Okay, so that haploid gametophyte stage, so remember, it's a multicellular, it's an organism, right? It's a plant, and you can see it. So it's haploid cells. So within that stage, it's going to produce gametes. The gametes are going to be produced by mitosis, which makes sense, right? You're going to go from haploid to haploid, okay? Those gametes, which are haploid, are going to fuse. So you're going to have fertilization. And when they fuse, they're going to form the diploid zygote stage. And then that zygote is going to undergo several stages of mitosis, develop and grow into the diploid sporophyte stage. So now you're back to number 1. Okay? All right, let's see this on a diagram, and it'll probably make more sense. Okay, so we're going to start here with this flower. Okay? So in this case, the flower, so this, by the way, this figure is representing a typical angiosperm plant. It's a little bit stylized. It's a typical angiosperm plant. And so all of these cells here that you're seeing right here, these are going to be diploid. Okay, so diploid plant, diploid flower. So on this particular flower, and we'll talk about flower types in a minute, but on this flower you have anthers, right? So you have your stamens and you have your stigma, style, and ovary, right? So you have your carpels and your stamen. Okay, so if you look at the anther, and then in a minute we'll look at the ovule. So in both cases, these are diploid structures, okay? But there's going to be a cell within this. So this is called a microsporangium. This is called a megasporangium, okay? And there's a cell in each, right? Here's the megasporangium. Here's the microsporangium in here, okay? The cell are going to undergo meiosis. So they're going to go from diploid to haploid. And when they do, they're going to form spores. The microspore is the male version, haploid. The female is called the megaspore. So microspore, megaspore. So these are each haploid cells, okay, produced via meiosis, okay? Okay, now what's going to happen is within these sporangia, right, there's going to be mitosis. So each cell is going to undergo mitosis. It's going to divide. In this case, each microspore is going to divide to form 2 cells, and this is the pollen grain. So both of these cells are haploid. So remember, you went from the haploid microspore to these 2 spores. Together, these spores are going to form the pollen grain. So one of these is referred to as the, we're going to go over this in a minute. So there's the generative cell and the tube cell, okay? In the female, so this megaspore right here, haploid, it's going to undergo mitosis. By the way, recall that this single megasporocyte, this large megasporocyte is going to undergo meiosis. you're going to end up with 4 cells. And you do this with the microspore too. So the microsporocyte is going to undergo meiosis, form 4 cells, but you're only seeing 1 here. We're only showing you 1. The other 3 do exist. In this case, what happens though is you get 4 cells, but 3 of them are going to degenerate, and you'll just end up with 1 egg. Very similar to what happens in humans, right? So you have the single cell that, as it undergoes meiosis, you're going to have 4 cells, but 3 of them are going to be polar bodies, and only 1's going to be the egg. Okay, so same thing here. So these are haploid, but this megaspore is going to undergo mitosis. It's going to end up forming 8 haploid nuclei, again through mitosis. And together, this is the female gametophyte stage. This pollen grain, this is the male gametophyte stage, okay? So haploid multicellular stage. Now don't get too excited. It's not like you have a haploid plant going on here, but hold your horses because you are going to see an example of that in just a second. Okay. So it's important to note that in angiosperms, not only that you have this gametophyte stage, so multicellular haploid stage, it just happens that in angiosperms, this particular stage has been considerably reduced. In more ancestral plants, this gametophyte stage is dominant. You actually see these plants that are haploid out in the field, and they form a more dominant stage in the life cycle of those ancestral plants, but you don't see that in angiosperms. I'm going to show you that life cycle in just a second. Okay, so then we're going to go over the details in a moment, but then pollination occurs. So you have this pollen cell that's going to be dispersed somehow, and various plants do it differently, but it's going to land on the stigma of the female reproductive parts. So remember what's happening here, right? So this is just a full tube, right? It's just full tissue. There's no tube there. So this tube cell in the pollen grain is basically going to Minecraft its way down in through the style. And then, by the way, this generative cell, again, that's haploid, is going to undergo mitosis, form 2 sperm cells. So they're all going to travel down this tube until it gets into the egg. It's going to go through fertilize. We're going to talk about fertilization in just a second. Once it fertilizes, right, one of the sperm is going to fertilize the egg. Now you have a diploid egg here, and it turns out, you're going to find out in a second, there's actually 2 sperm, right? So one's going to fertilize the egg, the other is going to fertilize these 2, it's going to fuse with these 2 nuclei from the polar bodies, forming triploid nutritive. So this is going to be the endosperm, or this is what's going to eventually develop into the endosperm. So now, point being is that you have 2 haploid gametes came together, fertilization. Now you've got a diploid cell here that's going to undergo several rounds of mitosis. When it does, it's going to form a seed, and isn't that cute? Look, it makes it look like it's in an apple. It's going to form the seed within this fruit. It's going to undergo multiple sequences of mitosis. Hopefully, ultimately, it's going to get dispersed. So now you have your diploid sporophyte stage here that's going to end up hitting the ground, developing and growing, and then developing flowers and starting all over again. Does that make sense? I hope so. Hopefully that's clear. We'll go over more of it in class. In contrast, by the way, here's a slide that's demonstrating more primitive plants, so things like mosses, ferns, bryophytes in general. And I just want to highlight a couple of things from this slide. I would definitely look at this slide in detail and try to commit it to memory. If we start over here, so this is the plant that if you were go out into the forest, this is what you'd see. So when you see mosses or ferns, the dominant form that you're looking at is the haploid gametophyte stage, okay? So that's what you're seeing here, haploid. What happens is when they undergo sexual reproduction, there are male forms and there's female forms. In this case, by the way, it's really important. These plants, they're generally very short, low to the ground, and they're often in wet environments, and they have to be for reproduction because the sperm actually swim away from the male plant and then go and fertilize the ovaries, the eggs on the female plant, right? So, and you can actually see this happening on rainy nights if you're lucky. True story. Anyway, so you got sperm swimming to the eggs. They fertilize the eggs on this gametophyte stage, right? When that fertilization event happens, now you're taking two haploid cells, fusing them. Now you have a diploid cell, right? So now you've got this diploid zygote that's going to undergo many rounds of mitosis to form this sporophyte stage. So here's the gametophyte stage, and in a weird sort of science, truth is stranger than fiction, the sporophyte stage is growing on the gametophyte stage. So how cool is that? And in these capsules, what's going to happen is you're going to have the production of spores, right, via meiosis. So you're going to go from this diploid stage with these diploid cells via meiosis to produce these haploid spores, which will then be released. They're dispersed by the wind. So each cell goes out. Remember, these are haploid. When they hit the ground, they'll start dividing via mitosis. They'll start developing this gametophyte stage, and the cycle continues. So this is a typical bryophyte or ancestral plant non-angiosperm life cycle. And speaking of which, if you were to examine the gametophyte and sporophyte stages in a number of plants, and see which ones the trend from dominant gametophyte to dominant sporophyte, what you find is that many ancestral, some would say primitive, although I usually refer, or I prefer not to use that term, but ancestral plants had a tendency to be dominant. The dominant form was the gametophyte stage. And as you work your way through the phylogeny, once you get to the angiosperms and the more advanced plants, they have a tendency to have a dominant sporophyte stage instead of a gametophyte stage. Okay, so now let's kind of ratchet down a little bit, talk about the parts of a flower and their functions. So this is sort of a stylized diagram of a plant, of a flower that has all the major bits on it. So the carpel is the female portions, and it consists of the stigma. This is the sticky part where the pollen's gonna stick down. The style, which is this, it's going to be a tube. It's not a tube yet, it's just dense tissue. And then the ovary. And then within the ovary, there can be several different compartments, each of which consists of an ovule. And within that ovule, ultimately an egg will develop. The male structures are collectively referred to as stamens, and they consist of the anther. This is where the pollen grains are going to be dispersed from, and then the filament. And then it's really important to note the petals around the outside, and then the sepals, which collectively together are referred to as a calyx. All right, so what are the functions of all these different parts of the flower? So the sepals, going from bottom to top, right? You see these here. So they're generally green and they're photosynthetic, relatively thick. So when the flowers are initially developing in their buds, these sepals protect the flower buds, keeps them safe as they're growing. And then once open, they actually, frequently there can be nectaries in the bottom, and so they're protecting the nectaries as well. And as I mentioned before, all of the sepals together are referred to as the calyx. The petals are, of course, often brightly colored, and their primary function is to attract pollinators for those plants that are pollinated by other organisms that are not wind dispersed. And it turns out there can be a lot of adaptations among flower petals, in terms of the coevolution with the pollinators that are pollinating those flowers. And you'll see some examples in just a second. By the way, one thing that's being highlighted in these pictures is the fact that many pollinators can see in the UV, and plants actually will frequently have different patterns that you can see only in the UV and that we don't see to the naked human eye. Okay, so at the base of the petal can be the nectary glands. And nectar can be harvested by pollinators, and this is a useful way to attract pollinators to you for more efficient pollination. And it's a win-win situation. They're helping the plant get pollinated. At the same time, they're getting something to eat. So the stamens are, again, these are going to produce the male gametophytes, or the pollen grains. And as I already mentioned, you have the filament. This is the slender stalk, and then the anther where the pollen grain production is going to occur. And in the carpels, you're going to have the eggs being produced. And so it's going to produce the female gametophyte, which is then going to produce the eggs. So everything that you're seeing right here, this is diploid, right here. Okay, so and continuing with the female, so the stigma, again, is the sticky trap that receives the pollen. The style is the stalk, and the ovary is the enlarged structure at the base. Oh, sorry, as I mentioned, inside the ovary, the female gametophytes are produced in ovules, and when mature, are going to produce eggs. And then let's talk about different kinds of flowers. This is going to be a bit of a simplification, but flowers, generally speaking, can come in two types. You can have flowers where both the male and the female parts are on that flower at the same time, like you see here. That's called a perfect flower. But you can also have flowers where it's just the male portions, the pollen-producing portions, or it can be the egg-producing portions that are only on the flower. And those flowers are referred to as imperfect flowers. Now, contrast those terms with when you're looking at the plant, the entire plant, okay? It's referred to as being monoecious if an individual plant has both male flowers and female flowers, okay? So you can have them, they can be perfect flowers or they can be imperfect flowers, doesn't really matter. But when an individual plant has both male and female flower parts on them, that's referred to, the plant is referred to as being monoecious, okay? So corn is an example of a monoecious plant. Dioecious plants are ones where when you're looking at the whole individual plant, it has only male flowers ever, or it has only female flowers ever. And I didn't put this picture on here, but cannabis apparently is dioecious. Good to know. Okay, so now let's go down into the reproductive process a bit more deeply and talk about gametophytes being produced in angiosperms. And by the way, isn't this a fabulous scanning electron micrograph? This is pollen grains. Turns out pollen grains, so you know how I was going on and on about hemipenes last week? Turns out pollen grains, morphology is highly variable as well. Species specific, and so you can actually dig in the soil, or you can even find fossilized pollen grains, and you can identify what those plants are just from the morphology of the pollen. So cool. Okay, so let's start with the female process. So remember, here's your whole carpel, here's your ovary, and if you look up close, right now, this is at the beginning of the stage. So this is a megasporangium, it's diploid, and here's the megasporocyte. Whenever you see cyte, C-Y-T-E, at the end of the term, so you can think of that as being the immature version of what's ultimately going to come, okay? So this is the megasporocyte, and this is eventually going to form the egg, or the spore. So the sporocyte forms the spore. Okay, so so you got the megasporangium, this is diploid, and the megasporocyte, this is a single cell that's diploid. It's going to undergo meiosis, and as always happens with meiosis, you always end up with going from a one diploid cell to having 4 haploid cells, but all haploid cells don't necessarily continue to perform a function. Some of them degenerate out, and that's what you see here. So the megasporocyte, diploid, undergoes meiosis. You get 4 cells that are produced, 4 haploid cells, but 3 of these are going to degenerate, and you're going to be left with a single megaspore. So the megasporocyte eventually divides and forms the megaspore, haploid. Now this haploid cell is going to undergo mitosis, and it's going to develop 8 haploid cells, okay? And all of these together within the megasporangium is now going to be referred to as the female gametophyte. Okay, so this is the female gametophyte stage. So you have these 8 haploid cells, and what happens to each of these cells differs a little bit depending on the species that you're talking about. But what is generally true for all angiosperms is that one of these haploid cells is going to form the egg, which you see right here. 2 more are going to lie adjacent to the egg, and these are going to be the synergids. They have a function later we'll talk about. 2 of these are going to form polar nuclei that have a very important function that we'll talk about later. And what happens with these ones, again, is going to vary from species to species. So we're going to focus on the similarities. Okay? So here is the sporophyte stage. Here is the gametophyte stage. Okay? And the gametophyte stage has produced the gametes. Here you go, egg. And now we'll talk about the male. Let's see. Oh yeah, so you should also know all of these eggs together. So now we don't really refer to this as the megasporangium, it's the embryo sac. Yeah, just what I said. One of these becomes egg. Okay, and then this is just a close-up. So in many angiosperms, the embryo sac contains 8 haploid nuclei and 7 cells because these 2 are actually gonna combine together. So the 2 polar nuclei stay together within one central cell. And then you have the egg cell and the synergids at the base near the micropyle. So this is where the sperm from the pollen grain are going to ultimately enter and fertilize the egg. Okay. So let's talk about the male part. So the anther is more appropriately referred to as the microsporangium, or it's filled with microsporangia. And within the microsporangium is the microsporocyte, so a diploid cell. So this cell is going to divide by meiosis. It's going to produce 4 microspores, and these are going to be haploid. So microsporocyte, diploid, meiosis forms 4 microspores that are haploid. Now, each of these cells is going to divide once by mitosis, and when it does, each of these is going to form a pollen grain. And this is the gametophyte stage, the male gametophyte stage. So everything's haploid, and you've got 2 cells, the generative cell, which is ultimately going to form the sperm, and the tube cell. It's got a tough outer coat as well. So here's what happens. Oh, sorry. Microsporocytes, haploid spores, pollen grain. Yep, got it. Okay. So I'm showing you more and more pictures of these cells. I think you get the picture. Now, let's talk about pollination. So what happens with those cells? So pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from one anther to a stigma. So it's not synonymous with fertilization. So pollination is merely the pollen grain dispersing in the variety of ways that they can and then sticking onto the stigma. That's pollination. Fertilization comes afterwards. And here I say it occurs when a sperm and an egg unite to form a diploid zygote. So they're separated in time and in space. So plants, many plants, not all, but many plants are capable of self-fertilization or selfing. And of course, this is when the sperm and the egg from the same individual unite and produce offspring. But you can imagine that this could have some serious consequences if it's repeatedly done and if mutations occur. So there's many reasons why selfing, it's probably best to avoid selfing. Or at least maybe it's best to say that there are benefits to not selfing. There are pros and cons to both. Outcrossing, which is more common, occurs when a sperm from one plant fertilizes an egg from a different plant. So A and B would represent selfing, C would represent outcrossing. Okay, so if you wanted to prevent selfing from happening, there's 3 primary ways that plants can do this. So the first is called temporal avoidance. Oh, and I've got some props. Let's see. So temporal avoidance occurs when male and female gametophytes within a perfect flower mature at different times. Oh, let's see. I don't have a really good one where you can see both the male and the female parts, but this is actually sort of a decent example. This is a fake flower, but still a good representation of what it looks like in real life. So here's the anthers, right? And the stigma, in this case on this plant, is way down here at the bottom. Oh wait, that's spatial avoidance. Sorry, this is spatial avoidance that I'm talking about here. So if you had this sort of a situation where the stigma is way down here and the anthers are way up here, it'd be really hard for the pollen to actually fall down and hit the stigma here. It could happen, but there are other flowers that do just the reverse. Maybe all the way up here you have the stigmas and the anthers are down here. Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, stigmas up here, anthers down here. And when that happens, it's really hard for the pollen grains from down here to actually hit the stigmas up here. So that would be a great example of spatial avoidance, where they actually avoid being close together in space. Okay. Temporal avoidance is when, let's say you had a perfect flower and you had both the female and male reproductive parts on the flower. What those plants can do is you can have, say, the male parts maturing before the female parts mature on this particular plant. So then, okay, pretend for a second I have two different plants here. Okay, I'm going to show you two different flowers, but imagine it's two different plants. So if I had only the male parts mature on this one and only the female parts mature on this one, then they could safely fertilize the pollen could fertilize the eggs, and then there'd be no problem, right? So it'd be outcrossing again if they were different plants. And the same thing would be true if, like, you had all male flowers and all female flowers. In that case, if you're dioecious like that, there's really little chance that you would ever be able to self anyway. So no problem. So you can have temporal avoidance where you have different parts that are mature at different stages so that you can avoid selfing. You can have spatial avoidance where maybe within the plant you have only the males on one plant that are mature and only the female plants, or you can have those stigmas and stamens at different places on the plant where they can't exchange gametes. Or in this third case, molecular matching. So maybe this is a case where it's possible you could have sperm that transfers to the stigma on the same plant, but there's molecular breakdown. And basically, the sperm from those pollen grains are unable to complete fertilization within their same plant. And so it breaks down. So this is called molecular matching. So when occurs when plants can recognize self and non-self tissues, and the species is self-incompatible. And sometimes what will happen too is the pollen grains will reach the stigma, but then it recognizes that, oh wait, this is the same plant, and then the pollen tube won't grow and go through the style. Okay, so another concept, forgive me. All this pollen, all this oak pollen is killing me, even in the snow. Okay, so another concept you should be familiar with is pollination syndromes. So here I say, in most cases, animal pollination is an example of a mutualism, so a mutually beneficial relationship between two species. So in the classic example here, you have bees that are pollinating, all kinds of bees are pollinating all kinds of flowers. And so it's a win-win situation where the bee is getting probably nectar as well as pollen. So sometimes they'll actually consume pollen, but they're going to get pollen all over them, as you see here. And the benefit is the plant is going to have greater success in pollination. So the bee is going to pick up pollen from one plant. It's going to travel to another flower. It's going to dump the pollen, or it's going to accidentally hit the stigmas. Bada boom, bada bing, you got pollination that's just occurred. But there are many examples of plants and animals that are co-evolving through these mutualistic situations, such that the plants develop adaptations to facilitate attracting the pollinator, and the pollinator has specific adaptations that make it possible for them, and maybe only that species, to pollinate the plant and then also receive the benefits of nectar. And here's a classic example of that. So hummingbirds are frequently strongly adapted to plants that have a particular kind of morphology. And so they have these long tubes that you need to reach way down into to get nectar. And these birds not only often have long beaks, but they have incredibly long tongues to reach down in there and get the nectar. And there's even more examples. I'll show you some more pictures in class of just some amazing adaptations that plants have. Oh, so here you go. And here's like a moth that has an incredibly long proboscis that it can reach down into these highly modified flowers and reach the nectar. And so this is great because these moths need this plant to feed, right? And the plant definitely needs this moth in order to pollinate it. And so they've evolved together with these adaptations that you can see. So pollination syndromes are suites of flower characters that are associated with certain types of pollinators. So 2 examples that we give here, bird pollinated flowers tend to be red, not only red, but they tend to be red. They tend to be unscented, and they're open during the day when birds are active. Moth and bat pollinated flowers have a tendency to be white or lighter colored. They're strongly scented to help you find them at night, and they're open at night. Now, of course, you should be familiar with the fact that not all plants are pollinated by animals. So many have wind-dispersed pollen. And in this case, they have different morphological features that facilitate that wind pollination. So in like oaks, birches, pecans, and many grasses, not all of them, but many of them, they have flowers that have really small petals or no petals at all, so they don't get in the way. And these species lack nectaries, and they don't invest in a lot of structures that would otherwise be required for pollination. So everything about them is adapted to facilitate wind dispersion. And actually, I wish we were showing you better pictures here. I had a hard time finding good ones. But like these catkins, these structures that you're seeing right here, these are catkins. You'll often see these fall to the ground. Actually, here in a couple of weeks, you're going to see them littering the ground. And they fall off the tree once all the pollen has been dispersed. And to give you a sense of what this looks like, check this out. So there's somebody's at the bottom knocking on the tree, and all of that is oak pollen that's falling off the tree. Pretty impressive stuff. But I want you to think about the fact that you're now walking amongst and inhaling plant semen. That's really what that is. No, I don't want to watch it again. Oh, there we go. Okay, so now let's describe the events of fertilization in angiosperm. So we've talked about pollination. That's getting the pollen grain over to the stigma, and that's it. Now what happens? Okay, so the pollen grain is going to land right on here on the stigma, right? And then what's going to happen is that the tube cell in the pollen grain is going to begin Minecrafting its way down through this style. So there's no tube here, right? It's going to build the tube. And then the generative cell is going to divide via mitosis. Remember, it's already haploid, but it's going to divide via mitosis, form 2 cells, and those are each going to form sperm, okay? So it Minecrafts its way down this tube. Here you go. There's a tube nucleus. Here's the 2 sperm. Boop, 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 bonk, bonk, bonk. It's going to go all the way down until, remember, there's that little opening at the bottom, the micropyle, right? So once the tube cell like bursts through the micropyle, one of those pollen grain sperm is going to fuse with the egg, and that's going to be the zygote, if you will, but it's not really a zygote. You'll see what it forms in just a second. The second sperm is going to unite with those 2 polar nuclei, and boom, it's going to form a triploid cell that's then going to divide via mitosis, and it's going to form the endosperm, or the nutrients for the developing seed. So this part is referred to as double fertilization because you've got 2 sperm and they're each fertilizing 2 different structures at the same time, 2 different cells. Oh, duh. So this is just going through telling you what I just told you. Blah, 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 blah. Yeah, so it forms the endosperm tissue. Really bad about clicking through these slides, sorry. Okay, so now you've fertilized the egg, and you're going to develop seeds and, of course, fruits. Because that's the definition of fruits, right? Fruits are these nutritive structures that are surrounding and protecting the seeds of whatever that plant is. So what are the parts of the seed? Well, if you were to split them apart, now there's different kinds of seeds. You've got your dicots and your monocots, right? So on the outer part of the seed is the seed coat, which is going to protect it. It's usually a hard kind of a surface, right? On the inside, here's the endosperm. So this is kind of the yolk, if you will, of the seed. So it contains the nutritive material. It's going to help it to germinate and grow. And then you have the cotyledons, right? So these are like the seed leaves, if you will. Sorry, so this is the seed leaf and this is the seed leaf, my bad. So you're only looking at endosperm here in the monocot, not over here. And then in the very center is the embryonic stem and root. So this is what's going to ultimately end up growing into the plant. Okay, so seeds contain stored nutrients that increase offspring success in crowded habitats. That's what's in the endosperm. Seedlings can subsist on stored nutrients until they're well enough established to absorb water from the soil and feed themselves via photosynthesis. And you guys already know this. You've already done experiments in lab that highlighted those functions. So here's a typical sort of fruit. So the fruit is composed primarily, we're going to be a little simplistic on this, but it consists of the pericarp, which is the tissue that surrounds the seeds. And then, of course, you can see all the little seeds inside each of these compartments, right? So the pericarp protects it, but the function of a fruit in general is to attract animals to eat it and to help disperse those seeds. Now, that's not to say that these couldn't drop to the ground and the seeds could then fall out and then grow. They could grow on their own. But this facilitates being picked up and carried and dispersed further and further away from the parent plant. So there's different kinds of fruits, and we'll just go over a few kinds of these. There's simple fruits. So these develop from a single flower with one carpel, or it may have some fused carpels, but usually just one. And so examples of this are things like cherries. You can have what's called an aggregate fruit. So this is developing from a single flower, but this single flower has a lot of different carpels. And then it ends up with a fruit like this. So each one of these little bits is from a different carpel. Oh, and so an example is a blackberry. You can have multiple flowers with many carpels that form a structure like this. So a multiple fruit, and a classic example would be a pineapple. All right, and then what if you had something like, a carrot? Yeah, that's not a fruit. No seeds in that. So is a tomato a fruit? Yes, it is. And so is a cucumber. What other kinds of fruits can you think of that most people would think of as being vegetables? And it really begs the question, why do produce sections erroneously refer to some produce as vegetable when really it's a fruit? It's a mystery, that. Okay, last but not least, just to reiterate, the two functions of fruit are to protect the seeds from physical damage and from seed predators. And of course, they aid in dispersal because they attract these animals that are going to eat them and then are going to carry them off and either drop bits of them or poop them out. And you probably already know that lots of seeds are actually adapted to where they will not germinate unless they've passed through the gut of some animal that has acids and a digestive system such that it'll actually start breaking through that seed coat so that it can germinate. Neat stuff. Okay, that's all I got on plant reproduction. We'll talk more about development in a subsequent lecture. See you later.